Okay. So Iran in 1953, a lot of talk about things about Iran today in the news. So it's appropriate to look into the 1953 coup and its long-term consequences, both for the United States and the Middle East at large. The consequences today, not that you can draw always a perfectly direct line, but the unintended consequences today of everything that's going on with Iran, and now the United States is even talking about war with Iran, stems from intervention in Iran in 1953, the Cold War era, the post-World War II era. But not to get into all of the history of Iran, because that is necessary to really understand what's going on with that, but more to look at what the result of the CIA coup uh, that overthrew the elected government of Iran and replaced it with a government that they thought would be more friendly to U.S. interests and anti-communism, and also more friendly to British interests, who also had uh, interests in the region, particularly oil and other things of that nature. So they wanted a friendly government there. Anyway, 1953. So it is the middle of the Cold War. And then what were the consequences for the Middle East and the United States from the secret coup, that is the overthrow or the help to overthrow government of Iran in 1953? Okay. So this is called Operation Ajax. It can easily be looked up now. Most Americans didn't know about it during the time unless they were in the higher levels of the US federal government or the CIA or British intelligence, or unless they were Iranians. People didn't know about this until years and years later, really until the late 1970s, 1980s, did people become aware of it. And many Americans don't know about it today. So they hear about Iran in the news. Here is a picture of Mohammad Mossadegh. He was the democratically elected prime minister of Iran. Most people don't know that Iran actually did have a democratic and constitutional government that was established and was electing. And Mossadegh was educated in Switzerland, educated in the West, was uh, more of a secular ruler. He was a Muslim, but was more very westernized, very secularized, and was elected to power as prime minister. And his contention was mainly with the British government over the issues of control over the British had over years, decades and decades, had invested in capital and invested in machines and tools to um, drill for oil. Unions were allowing this. The governments had contracts that allowed the British to do this. And then Mossadegh comes into Iran and at one point finally nationalizes the oil, meaning it kind of removes the British control and says that the Iranians are going to be in charge of the oil of Iran. And so anyway, the CIA and British intelligence worked together. The CIA is, of course, the United States, worked together to covertly overthrow the government of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. The CIA, by the way, is created in 1947. It used to be an intelligence gathering operation bureau, but it didn't stay that for very long, and it's not that today. It does that, but what it really does is gets covertly and sometimes overtly, meaning out in the open, but usually secretly does things to impact governments. It assassinates people. It creates information campaigns. It hires people to do certain things. So the CIA has this involvement almost from the beginning. Mohammed Mossadegh replaced the Shah of Iran, the leader, the Shah of Iran, the kind of religious, political, royal leader, Mohammed Reza Shah, who so when Mossadegh is removed, uh, Reza Shah is brought back into power with the help of the United States. He becomes the dictator of Iran once again. And the motivation for the British and American governments is concern over one, as I mentioned, Iranian nationalization of the oil, and two is the concern over whether Iran would fall to communism. There is a communist party also vying for control of Iran during this time. So it's the middle of the Cold War. The prevailing theory of the time is the domino theory that as communism spreads, countries will fall to communism like dominoes. It will spread and take over the world. So there's this what's called bipolarity between the big power of the United States and the big power of the Soviet Union during this time. And so this creates a situation of competition for the loyalty or at least friendliness or neutrality of these states like Afghanistan, Vietnam, Iran, all these states, Korea. Anyway, so those are the issues at the time. These actions are virtually unknown to Americans. The Americans, average American, had no idea that this coup was going on during the time. But what were the consequences for Iran, the United States, and the Middle East in general because of this? Here are some of the consequences in this overthrow of this democratically elected leader and replacement with this Shah of Iran who becomes or continues as the dictator of Iran. This is the consequences for Iran. It's just some of them. Number one, we already talked about this. Mohammad Reza Shah becomes the dictator of Iran, and he receives over $1 billion taxpayer support from the United States, aid given to him in the decade following the coup. So you could talk about the opportunity cost of that money. What could have been done with that $1 billion had it not been going to the dictator of Iran? Iranians also turned against him because they had gone from not a regime that we would be used to in the United States by any means, but they had gone from a regime that did have a constitution, it did have representative elections, it did have some type of parliamentary constitutional system to a US installed dictator or US supported dictator and his oppressive Islamic regime over the people. Now, the people are all Muslims, but so that's not really the issue. It's the kind of fascism of the control of that government. 1979, the Iranians explode in anger in the Iranian Revolution or the Islamic Revolution, led by Islamic fundamentalists, and they overthrow the government of the Shah. So they finally had enough and they overthrow this government again. After this, get to the next slide here. US President Jimmy Carter at the time allows the Shah to come to the United States and have some safe haven there. Now, the problem with that is is the Americans weren't aware of this, but the Iranians were aware of the coup. Before, the Americans in 1953 had removed the government in order to try to reinstall the Shah. Now, years later, 1979, there's been another revolution, and now the Shah is going to the United States. The Iranians feared that the United States would again use the CIA, use the covert powers of their government to reinstall a government that was more friendly to their interests. So the Americans only see it as, okay, the Iranians overthrow the Shah and we're allowing him to come to the United States. What ends up happening is the Iranian hostage crisis, which Americans didn't have any way of explaining or understanding. It looked random. It looked nonsensical because they had no idea of the previous relationship between the US CIA and Iran. So Iranians feared another 1953-like coup, and the US CIA helped to reinstall the Shah to power. What ends up happening is the Iranian hostage crisis. To block that from happening, Iranian Islamic radicals stormed the American embassy in Tehran, Iran, and take it over and take 52 Americans hostage for more than 14 months because their fear was they were not about to let the CIA and the US government come in there and try to manipulate the results of the revolution. But to Americans, this made no sense. This just created a hostility in Americans toward Iran, who had just captured and held hostage a bunch of Americans in their embassy for apparently no reason. But there was a reason. It was because of the previous coup. This is the first time Americans really become aware of this. The Iranian hostage crisis poisons relations between Iran and the United States, and that's basically existed and amplified to this day. And it also led to the US support of Iraq against Iran in war. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Let me read a quote from this book, All the Shah's Men, that documents and goes through the story of this in Iran. This is actually a quote in the book from one of the hostage takers, the Iranian hostage takers in the hostage crisis. He said, "In the back of everybody's mind hung the suspicion that the admission of the Shah to the United States, the countdown to another coup d'etat had begun," one of the hostage takers explained years later. "Such was to be our fate. Again, we were convinced, and would be irreversible. We now had to reverse the irreversible." In other words, they were not about to let that happen again, and so they were afraid of the repeat of 1953. And that's what explains the Iranian hostage crisis. This Iranian hostage crisis led America, not the American people, but the American government and foreign policy establishment, to support Saddam Hussein and Iraq in a brutal war against Iran. Now, you've doubtless heard the name Saddam Hussein. You've doubtless heard of Iraq by now, which later the United States would fight 2 wars against. Kind of 3, because there's kind of a Iraq War 3 in the later 2000s. But anyway, the United States began to support Iraq. The power of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein gets consolidated because of this US support. It strengthens Saddam Hussein, in which he was a brutal dictator during this time. He used chemical weapons against his people during this time, and at this time the US and the British supported him. They also supported him in using chemical weapons against the Iranians in this war. Now, if you don't know, chemical weapons were one of the justifications for the future wars against Iraq. So see a little bit of the governmental hypocrisy here of when we're supporting Saddam Hussein, or I should say when the government is supporting Saddam Hussein using chemical weapons against the Iranians, that's allowable, that's acceptable conventions of war, that's not a war crime. But when he becomes a problem for us when he invades Kuwait, when he's disrupting the region. And later on, we say, okay, well, one of our justifications for a war against Iraq is that he used chemical weapons. Okay, so there's this change or this shift in thinking of what's allowable and not allowable. That's a different discussion for another time. Long story short, he was supported against Iran in war by both the US and British governments. The United States would later fight wars with Iraq in 1991 and 2003. Ayatollah Khomeini. So the militant elements in Iran get strengthened. They strengthen this revolutionary coalition, this area that was more the radical side that overthrew the government. They get emboldened by this, and they're the more willing to do extreme things. They're the more violent side of things in Iran, and Ayatollah Khomeini becomes the kind of religious political leader of this. Yeah, the next leader, a similar name, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, justified the regime's radicalism by claiming that the stronger they were and the more conservative they were, relatively speaking, would make them strong enough to avoid being overthrown by the CIA. He said, quote, "We are not liberals like Allende," which he was in Chile, he gets overthrown by the CIA later, "and Mossadegh, whom the CIA can snuff out." I mean, we're not these weak liberals. We're this militant, strong, conservative faction that's maintaining stability. And this maintains a radical, uh, oppressive regime in Iran going forward. Iran also becomes complicit in support for radical Islam and anti-Western terrorism. So the fundamentalist clerics, the religious leaders, consolidate power in Iran during the 1980s. They grow more powerful during this time. They implement a form of religious fascism in Iran, and they also propagate terrorism abroad. They support uh, terrorist tactics in other groups. And so they supported the hostage takers, obviously, in Tehran, Iran in 1979. They financed and armed Hamas and Hezbollah and other Middle Eastern factions that are known to commit political kidnappings and assassinations. In 1983, they were seen to be complicit in the suicide bombing that killed 214 American Marines in Beirut. 94, there was a bombing of a Jewish community in Buenos Aires that killed 93 people, specifically targeted to be an anti-Semitic terrorist attack. And in 1996, they were also complicit in an attack that killed 19 Marines. This is the government, or this is the power structures that came to be in place, and a line can be drawn back to the removal of the government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. This was the government that stepped in, the powers that stepped in to replace it. Religious, political, secular, doesn't matter. They all filled this void and created some of the problems that we've had for the last really 50 or 60 years and continue to have today. Lastly, Afghanistan, the Taliban government, and Al-Qaeda. Iran's revolutionary leaders became something of an inspiration to the fanatics in other countries, like Osama bin Laden. A communist coup, so in Afghanistan, a communist coup, so the communists had their kind of Vietnam with Afghanistan, which, by the way, the US was supporting the Mujahideen and these other groups, including Osama bin Laden, who was also supporting these groups in Afghanistan to fight the Russians, the Soviets during this time, because the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. But there was a communist coup in Afghanistan that overthrew the government in 1978 that created this power struggle between the communists and the local Mujahideen. Now, eventually, the Soviet Union collapses and falls apart, but there's a war of attrition that takes place in Afghanistan that takes place over years and is a drain on the resources of Russia, Soviet Russia, during this time. And during this time, the Americans are supporting the other side of things in Afghanistan and also working with Osama bin Laden during this time. The Taliban government eventually takes over, and asserts a harsh but effective government based on religious authority and acceptance of tribal leaders. So it does have that legitimacy, even though it is an oppressive regime. And so it has this, it takes over, and this Taliban government is eventually the government that gives Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda a base from which to launch the 9/11 attacks. Now, let me say just quickly, there's the Taliban, which is the government, or was the government of Afghanistan, and Al Qaeda. They're not synonymous. They have worked together in the past, but they're not the same thing, and that distinction is important for other purposes to understand. But the Taliban government, because of this emboldening it receives from governments like Iran and what they had been able to accomplish, gives Osama bin Laden this haven from which to launch the 9/11 attacks. All this, now we can't rewrite history. Good historians do not speculate on what would have happened otherwise. But what we can draw here are some lessons about unintended consequences from something like the interventionism of the CIA covertly removing an elected leader from another country. Uh, Stephen Kinzer, author of this book, All the Shah's Men, that documents this, says the world has paid a heavy price for the lack of democracy in most of the Middle East. Operation Ajax has taught tyrants and aspiring tyrants that the world's most powerful governments were willing to tolerate limitless oppression as long as the oppressive regimes were friendly to to the West and to Western oil companies. That helped tilt, correct that spelling there, that helped tilt the political balance in the region away from freedom and toward dictatorship. So the US, at one point, the US government was willing to overthrow an elected constitutional government in favor of a dictatorship because of one, anti-communism. I think that's a bigger reason than the oil. And then two, when they say that, when people talk about the oil and all that, what they're meaning, but probably not realizing, is there's not a threat to go in there and just steal the oil. That's not the issue. It's realizing how much the world runs off of fossil fuels and oil, and then recognizing that what is needed is a friendly regime, and that's what and that can boil over into control of that region, which those in that region may see as occupation, the bases and wars and bombings and sanctions. So the unintended consequences here are that it showed that the US CIA, at least in this case, was at odds with the American values of constitutionalism, representative government, because the US CIA was willing to get rid of that in another country if it was able to replace it with a dictatorship more in line with US CIA interests. Goes on, for Americans, the unintended result was a rise of political Islam leading to the 1979 revolution and the present continuing impasse in Iranian-US relations. Both big consequences for the world to this day. Another historian writes on this, it is a reasonable argument that but for the coup, Iran would be a mature democracy. Now that could be debated, but this is one historian's take on it. So traumatic was the coup's legacy that when the Shah finally departed in 1979, many Iranians feared a repetition of 1953, which was one of the motivations for the student seizure of the US embassy. The hostage crisis, in turn, precipitated the Iraqi invasion of Iran. While the Islamic Revolution itself played a part in the Soviet decision to invade Afghanistan. A lot of history, in short, flowed from a single week in Tehran. In the 1953 coup and its consequences were the starting point for the political alignments in today's Middle East and Inner Asia. With hindsight, can anybody say that the Islamic Revolution of 1979 was inevitable, or did it only become so once the aspirations of the Iranian people were temporarily expunged in 1953? So this is often what conservatives, more actually neoconservatives, fail to recognize, but which they can see in domestic policy. In domestic economic policy, conservatives can usually see that these economic ideas like raising the minimum wage or tax on gas or things like this will have unintended consequences in the economy. That's one of the laws, basically, of economics. But where conservatives don't follow that logic through is typically on the unintended consequences of foreign policy. Usually liberals, or they used to be at least, the anti-war left, used to be better on understanding the unintended consequences of foreign interventionism. One more historian to finish this off writes, in retrospect, the United States sponsored coup d'etat in Iran of August 19th, 1953 has emerged as a critical event in post world history. I can't talk. Post-war world history. The government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, which was ousted in the coup, was the last popular, democratically oriented government to hold office in Iran. The regime replacing it was a dictatorship that suppressed all forms of popular political activity, producing the tensions that contributed greatly to the 1978-1979 Iranian Revolution. If Mossadegh had not been overthrown, the revolution might not have occurred. The 1953 coup also marked the first peacetime use of covert action by the United States to overthrow a foreign government. As such, it was an important precedent for events like the 1954 coup in Guatemala and the 1973 overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, and made the United States a key target in the Iranian Revolution.